from German and a PhD candidate in creative and critical writing at UEA. Her PhD project is a thesis exploring the significance of hybrid writing by women literary translators on the art of translation, and her own hybrid memoir exploring her life and work as a literary translator. An extract of this was longlisted for the Ivan Juritz Prize 2020, Great Achievement. She's translated over a dozen works of German language literature and was shortlisted for the Man Booker International Prize and the Schlegel Teak Prize. She has written columns on literary translation for The Quietus and the Brixton Review of Books, and she was the inaugural translator in residence at the British Library. In addition, she has published 2 collections of poetry and a collection of short fiction, and is now working on her first novel. So what we'll do is Jen will talk the first part of the session, and then we'll have the Q&A, and after that she'll lead a workshop. So over to Jen now.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Amazing, thank you. So I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes. It's not exactly a paper, it's more an introduction to my work for the PhD and my work as a literary translator and a writer, and at the end I'll finish with a very short reading. And if you'd like to stick around for the workshop, that would be amazing. It's a taster from my masterclass at the British Library, which I've done at many different places now. So if you fancy being a bit creative, do stick around. It's not scary, I promise. I'm very happy to be another elephant today. I thought that talk was brilliant, Thomas, and I really loved Zoe's talk as well. I love how punk has come up so much already today. I've played in punk bands for about 10 years, as long as I've been a literary translator, so I always appreciate a bit of punk entering the academic environment. Also, on a side note, I remember, because my PhD is creative critical, I was talking to a translation studies scholar about what my PhD project was, and their response was, oh, it doesn't really sound like a PhD, which I think is often the response still around this kind of creative critical work. So my background, as you've heard from the introduction, is as a writer and a literary translator. I'm currently working on my, I think, 15th and 16th book translation. So I translate contemporary German language literature, predominantly novels, but also some poetry, some academic essays very rarely. And I started as a translator, firstly as a writer. I was brought up monolingually, so my background is I'm half Maltese and half English, but I was only brought up with English, and I basically taught myself advanced German only from reading German novels, German language novels. So that's how I acquired my German, and so I started predominantly as a writer who understood how to write fiction, how to write poetry, and then took on another language and another literary culture. And that was my way in. So rather than learning the language first and then developing my creative writing, I did it that way. And then my PhD started in 2019, where I never thought that I would be doing a PhD. I did an MA in German studies a few years ago, many years ago, in fact. And I didn't really understand where my place would be in academia. I'm the first person in my whole family to have done post-16 education. So the prospect of entering academia just didn't seem like something that was ever going to happen for me. But then coming across this idea of the knowledge that I had acquired as a literary translator was valuable knowledge, and that it was something that I could form into a research project and be able to write creatively about translation, was something I was very excited about, and is something I've been interested in right from the very beginning of being a translator. So I've written articles and columns and written poetry and fiction about translation. I've always found other ways of translating the experience of being a literary translator into other forms, because I want other people to have access to that knowledge, be it people who are monolingual, who don't really understand what is going on when we have other languages, but also new literary translators who want to understand how you get into literary translation, where you begin, obviously very focused on how creative it is as an art form. And this is something which now blends into where my research aspect of my project is. So translation studies had a creative turn where we started thinking about the translator as a creative writer. That, you know, it wasn't just a matter of analysing the translator's works, but thinking about them as agents who are producing their own, you know, they have creative writing skills, they're artists in creative writing. It's not a mechanical process, which is often how it has been considered and continues to be considered, that the literary translator isn't a creative person that you're just copying, which obviously comes from a lack of knowledge around what it is when we translate. More recently then we had the turn to literary translation studies, and then even more recently we have literary translator studies, and there's actually a new book that's coming out very, very soon, the literary translation studies, which is part of the Walter Benjamin Library series. But what is continuing to be very interesting is that the writing by literary translators about their own practice is still largely absent. So it was very interesting listening to Thomas's talk, for instance, about how creative writers entered the university and how they entered those positions of being able to teach and also creative writing research. And now I think we're at that stage where it's now the literary translator that is trying to be recognised as a researcher and gaining access to the university. So even though we're now reaching literary translator studies, we're still just being analysed quite a lot, and that the writing by literary translators isn't as present as it maybe should be. It's something that gets brought up a lot, say at conferences looking at translators, is where are the translators talking about their practice and what they do. So this is something that really interests me, obviously, and I've been writing about my practice for so long that it became very normal, and I thought everybody did it. Obviously, this is not the case. Not all translators want to or can write about their practice. Not all translators think that we are creative writers. You know, not every translator is the same. We all have different views about what our process and practice is. But there has been joined to this kind of movement into looking at the literary translator and their life and their biography and their background and context. In kind of the mainstream publishing industry, we've seen that, say, the Man Booker Prize, which started recognising translators in 2017, 2016, which made a huge announcement to the world that literary translators should be seen as artists to the public, which then has opened up more of an appetite for translators as literary personalities, and therefore people that will write about what they do. So just looking at a few of the titles that I've been exploring as part of my research, we have Jennifer Croft's memoir Homesick. So Jennifer Croft won the Man Booker International Prize for her translation of Olga Tokarczuk's Flights a couple of years ago. And arguably the only reason this book could exist is because she won that prize, and because translators are getting more and more attention in the mainstream, but also within academia. So in this memoir, it's called a fictional memoir, but she is telling her life of how she acquired her languages. So she grew up in Oklahoma, monolingual, and then as a child became obsessed with Russian and Polish because she loved watching ice skating during the Olympics, and became obsessed with the Russian ice skating team, and then learned Polish, then learned Spanish, and she's now very much multilingual. There's also a new book that's just come out by Polly Barton, who's a translator of Japanese literature, called 50 Sounds, which comes out next week from Fitzcarraldo Editions. And in that book, Polly Barton explains how she acquired Japanese as a monolingual person, aged 21, moving to Japan. And again, Polly has been nominated for a number of awards as a translator. And again, you know, looking back maybe 5 or 10 years, there wouldn't be that appetite to read about literary translators, language acquisition, how they got into literary translation. There just wouldn't be that interest. A really important book that came out in 2017 is, excuse how terrible this copy looks, but This Little Art by Kate Briggs, who's a translator from French, who's translated Roland Barthes. And in This Little Art, which is a hybrid essay, she talks about her her understanding of translation in many everyday ways, such as doing aerobics or reading her children's stories in different voices. And she made a really important argument in this book around supposed errors in translation, or translators who've now been deemed to be sloppy in retrospect. And she argues that actually we need to look at translators' lives to better understand the context of where translations are produced, that you can't just deem someone's work in a certain way if you don't know their kind of social context, the lives that they were living, their educational background. Also gender is at play massively. So my research is predominantly focusing on women and non-binary translators, because I'm also interested in the gendered aspect of being a translator. So for instance, looking at how sexism comes into play, how certain translators are not trusted with the works of men, you know, if they identify as women translators. So there's monolingual translators, but there's also translators who speak multiple languages. So we have Muriel Gansel, translation as Transhumance, translated by Rochefort, and we also have Angry and Prayers by Maureen Freely. And both of these translators, who translate from I think German and French, but definitely Turkish in the case of Maureen Freely, they were brought up with many languages, and it talks about how they acquired those languages and were at home with them, but then lost them and then regained them. So I think what I'm also interested in is who these books are for and what they can help us do. So they can help future translators. There's a lot of information here for people that want to go into literary translation, but there's also information for those who we know are in the majority, who are multilingual in the world, and charting the ways that multilingualism or having a multilingual identity can shift over time, and also how you can also become a translator. Because for many years there was a lot of, I mean, arguably still, but there's prejudice against multilingual people, because there was this myth that you can only translate into your mother tongue, which obviously is very problematic, because many people have many mother tongues or just many languages. So I think these books are also important to really celebrate people's multilingualism and to show that there's a place for them in literary translation. And then also, as somebody who had to learn French and German on my own from the age of 16 to 18 because nobody wanted to do languages at my school, and I learned it in a broom cupboard with two very stressed teachers for 2 years. And as we know, again, we've got a massive crisis around language learning, especially in the UK. I think these books are really important to show how school isn't the end of your language experience, how actually many people acquire languages in very, you know, out of the study context, but also just from traveling, from meeting people, from living abroad, through personal study. It shows different avenues into language acquisition and different avenues into literary translation. So it's really just making a pluralized vision of multilingual identity and also translator identity. In terms of my own creative project, so as part of my PhD, I'm looking at these books that exist that are just coming out very recently. There are obviously older examples. There's Gregory Rabassa's If This Be Treason, which came out in the 90s, I believe. Probably getting all the dates wrong, obviously. And Edith Grossman's Why Translation Matters, which is less autobiographical. It's mainly in the preface and the first section of the book where she talks about her life as a literary translator, or how she acquired languages and got into literary translation. But most of these are coming out really recently, just in the last few years, and there are more on the way. There's going to be a proliferation of these writings. So my own memoir that I'm working on is called Fair, and the reason it's called this is because I've created an artificial structure for my book, which, because I'm incredibly interested in kind of interdisciplinary, multimodal ways of looking at the world. It's part art fair, part book fair, part fun fair, where the reader will go to different booths in this fair, which will be different sections, either long or short, and you get to experience, hopefully through the mode of personal essay slash kind of surreal personal essay, how I acquired my languages, my experiences being brought up monolingual in a kind of multilingual household, how I taught myself German, how I started translating, and my different experiences of working with different authors, etc. So the reason I structured it like this is I want it to be fun, I want it to be accessible. It's the only way I can really write, is in this kind of playful way. And also I didn't really want it to have an arc, because it's not like a rags to riches kind of thing. It's ever progressing and ever evolving. So I wanted to be little bits that the reader can either read in one kind of arc or just kind of dip in and out, and I'll have different tours, so you can decide if you want to see a specific thread in the book. You can go to different pages which will tell you about, say, family or German specifically, or the author-translator relationship, etc. And if it's okay, I've got a couple more minutes. I'll just do a little bit of a reading from the piece that was longlisted for the Ivan Uritz Prize. So thank you so much for listening. Really excited if you have any questions as well. So just have some water. So in this section I'm going to read, I wanted to try and recreate the experience of having the first ever impulse to translate. So I read my first ever German novel, which was Der Vorleser by Bernhard Schlink, which is The Reader. Some of you might have seen the kind of Hollywood film version of this book. And it took me a long time to read this book, but it was written in quite a clear, a very clear, uncomplicated way, and I found myself actually being able to access it, which I hadn't really been able to do at school. So in this piece, I'm taking you to a kind of little exhibition room where I want to introduce you to reading Der Vorleser for the first time and kind of translating it. In the centre on this plinth is a special artefact. The first novel I ever read in German, Der Vorleser, The Reader by Bernhard Schlink. A smooth white paperback typical of the publisher Diogenes, first released in 1995. I liked the cover, a detail from a painting by Kirchner of Nollendorfplatz that looks like an X, a warped fish-eyed gaze on a crossroads in dirty yellow and grey blue. That's the original painting, over there to the right of the lift. There's a mattress next to the plinth. You can sit on it if you want. Sit with me on it. Let's take down the book and try to read it. Let's ignore the books I should be reading for my undergraduate degree. In spite of living in Munich for nearly a year and an additional 3 months this summer, my German is still bad. Pretty much everyone I associated with only spoke to me in English. I worked in an English-speaking office. Before that, I had been an au pair for a wealthy family, and they had forbidden me from speaking anything other than English with their kids. I'd absorbed some of the language. It had improved, but I couldn't really say how. This is what I can make out from the first page up on the wall over there, that first blown up photocopy. It's a little wrinkly from the wheat paste. When I 15 had I. The illness began in the autumn and ended in spring. Colder and darker the old year became, weaker became I. First with the new year went it. January was warm and my mother, me the bed on the balcony. I saw the heavens, the sun, the clouds, and heard the children in the yard play. An early evening in February heard I a sing. For this version, I've Englished and started to decipher from guesswork, decisions still not made and dictionaries not yet reached for, on that wall over there. When I was 15, I had insert an illness. The illness began in the autumn and ended in the spring. The colder and darker the old year became, or got, the weaker I got, or became. It, I guess, improved only with the start of the new year. January was warm and my mother moved, set up the bed on the balcony. I saw the sky. It must mean heaven and sky. the sun, the clouds, and heard children playing in the yard. One early evening in February, I heard a insert a bird singing. I'm stunned and, unusually for me, excited. This is so much more than I had managed when trying to read the first page of The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka with my A-level teacher 2 years ago. The first chapter of part 1 of the reader is just over 2 pages long. I managed to read it about the boy who lived on Blumenstrasse, Flower Street, walking into Bahnhofstrasse, Station Street, and being sick on the pavement, then helped by a woman whose first move is to get him to slosh buckets of water to clean away the vomit, who holds him when he starts to cry and then takes him home. In a few lines, she goes from being a stern stranger to an object of desire through her hug where her breasts, Bruster, press against his chest, Brust, and the detail that he was blank taller than her, barely taller, but taller nonetheless. An intriguing dynamic is formed from one moment to the next. In the last few lines of this opening, he says that his mother told him to buy her flowers, introduce himself to her, I can read this now, and thank her. The last line of the opening, which draws me in completely with its abruptness and holding back, was, so I went at the end of February to the Bahnhofstrasse. It will take me about 9 months to get through the whole thing. Sometimes I'll use a dictionary, other times I'll let my eyes run over the lines and fill in massive holes in my knowledge with imagination. How would they go from here to there? What would she say to him if he had said that to her? How might he react at this point? Looking at this first page now, it feels so strange to know how I would translate it, how only I would translate it. Even stranger to think that I now pick up novels in German, open them, read them, and know how to translate them into books you buy in shops, that people trust me to do this. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Jen. That was amazing.
Well, thank you.
So now we have a few minutes for questions and answers, and I will try to put this kind of gallery view to see everyone, but also feel free to use the chat. And let's begin with Alex as a question.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed that. This is amazing stuff. Simply because it does away with a lot of preconceptions that people have about translation. And I think a lot of the things that you said about literary translation can also be said about translation and performance. Obviously, I will be talking about that tomorrow. But this concept of you only translate into your mother tongue, I love that. People, I mean that sarcastically. People really think that is the only direction language can take, from another language into your own mother tongue. And you think, why? I mean, is this how we work as humans in the world, where we could just move into one direction? So it's this kind of constant battle of convincing people that you've mentioned. This is quite interesting. And also the idea of the multilingual translator as an exotic being. I think that is very interesting as well. And it's very difficult, especially in Britain, to convince people otherwise, to convince them of the fact that you can actually do this in several languages, because to them, you must seem like an alien from outer space. And that, just the facial expression sometimes is quite interesting. And I think, sorry, I'm going on about this, but I think, sort of reading this with the gaps and your first experience, I think that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you for that, because this is one of the, interesting bits about learning languages, the acknowledgement that there are gaps, and the acknowledgement that filling these gaps is a creative exercise. It has to do with imagination. It has to do with exploring and with context. And I think you've done that perfectly. Thank you very much for that. This is great stuff.
Thank you so much. Yeah, just as a very brief response, but thank you for that. Yeah, I think it's something around this kind of blocking out multilingual translators. It's something that I think we have to unlearn this obsession with the mother tongue, because at the beginning of my career, all anyone ever said was, obviously you translate into your mother tongue. And I just took that as a given, because it's like, oh yeah, because I have a mother tongue apparently. And it was only when meeting translators that translate both ways or translate in multiple different ways. And also there's also a kind of colonialist gaze as well that is very problematic and is being engaged with at the moment around people's assumed fluency just because of their nationality or backgrounds. And it's something that really has to be fought on all fronts, because as I mentioned, and as we know, multilingual people are the norm. And it's just that we, in the, talking from a UK context, it's just something that we haven't really got used to yet.
Thank you. I see that Barbara has a question.
Hello, Jen.
Hi.
Hi, thank you so much. I, for one, I'm really excited to read the memoir and your thesis, which will probably become a book, I imagine, I'm hoping. And your name has come up a lot when I've had supervisor meetings and so on, because in my PhD, I'm looking at one literary translator, a female translator in the UK context. But I just felt that translation was too complex and dynamic just, to do justice in a sort of purely flat thesis, word only thing. So I'm looking at other ways, sort of multimodal ideas. But one thing that I have sort of been experimenting with and having fun with is, instead of just putting transcripts, putting little chunks of them into the draft thesis, I've been playing around with found poetry.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that, I think, is a really good way of distilling the essence of what is coming out from all the translation drafts and the data and so on. But yeah, can I just say thank you so much for what you're doing? Because it's so exciting. I can see this as being a sort of seminal point in the whole, this turn towards looking at the translator. And I totally agree with you that, because I sometimes have this, so I really want to draw on what's already there, and I'm constantly being told, but you need to look at peer-reviewed, proper translation study literature. And I think we really need to look at other sort of sources of knowledge and say, well, this is valid. And literary translators, in a way, have been peer-reviewed. They've gone through the editing process, they're read, they're published, and so on. So I think literary translators sort of need to be more on, we need to sort of be paying as much attention, but also giving them as much space in a thesis as other scholars.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. It's completely true, and I suppose that is one of the issues, isn't it, around why certain people do get left out of, say, thesis or academic, because of lacking that kind of peer review stage. And a lot of my sources from my research, because there are a few books, if anyone's interested, very, very few books at the moment, but there is in translation, translators on their work and what it means, which you're probably familiar with. So Esther Allen and Susan Banofsky's book, which is really, really good, and also translators on translating inside the invisible art. But it's the material is quite slim, but a lot of it is in the kind of online sphere. And also, as you probably know, a lot of these conversations are happening on things like social media, which are also incredibly difficult to do in referencing and things like that. It's something I'm terrified about in my third year next year, around how to include some of the most interesting conversations that aren't, taking place in peer-reviewed journals and things like this. But thank you so much.
And on that note, there was a question from Catherine Williams about the books you mentioned, Jen, and if you could possibly make that list.
Yes.
Share a written list.
Absolutely, I can put it in the chat.